But if everywhere in the United States is doing this, if the EPA is monitoring everywhere, then how did Flint, Michigan happen? That's a really great question. And I'll tell you this, Flint, Michigan has clean water. They have a drinking water facility just like us here in Maryland. That's not the problem. The problem isn't clean water coming out of that plant. The problem is the distribution system. Most of our pipes started as lead pipes everywhere. All of the pipes for our drinking water were lead pipes. Lead was really, really good at not corroding, at least compared to other metals. Because when water interacts with different metals, it makes them rust and break down. But after a while, these lead pipes did get old, and we're talking, nearly a century, if not more in some places. And so what drinking water facilities started doing is putting a chemical called a corrosion inhibitor. And they would put that in the drinking water, completely safe for humans, but they put it in the drinking water, and it essentially lined the pipes in order to make sure that they weren't rusting. And if they were rusting, that rust wouldn't enter the water supply. But in Flint, that's not what's happening. Their water is clean, but it's going through old lead pipes. And the water that they're pumping out does not have a corrosion inhibitor. They wanted to cut corners. They didn't want to pay for this corrosion inhibitor. So they didn't. So they're putting water through these pipes. These pipes are rusting and breaking down. And now you're having water that looks like this. Now, why is this just an issue now? Because Flint, Michigan got a new water source. They used to get their water from Detroit, but the mayor and the leadership in Flint, Michigan wanted to save money. It was expensive to get water from Detroit. They're like, oh, well, we've got a water body. We'll set up our own drinking water facility, and we'll get our own water. It'll be so much cheaper. And they didn't put the corrosion inhibitor because, again, they wanted it to be cheaper. And so then you get this issue of this water. Their water was chock full of lead. This is what the inside of those pipes look like. And it's unfortunate because a lot of pipes in the United States look like this. But typically there's a corrosion inhibitor on the inside of this that would prevent any of this from coming off. But in Flint, that's not what happened. It is coming off. It is mixing in the water. For a healthy adult, this lead is fine. But for developing children, this lead can be deadly. You might not die immediately of lead poisoning, but studies are already coming out seeing a different development of the children's brains who came out of this area, which is incredibly depressing. So how is that not happening here? Well, one, we living in the DC area, we have a lot of exposure. There's also a lot of people here. So if something like this were happening in DC, everyone would know about it and it would get fixed immediately. We also have a lot higher income here than in Flint. It's unfortunate, but the government, lawmakers, businesses take advantage of small towns because they can, because no one listens to them. Flint, Michigan has been going on for over a year at this point, and their water is still not clean, and they're still being charged for the water. So if this was happening in DC, though, that would have been fixed instantly. Why isn't the EPA stepping in? It's a really great question. And hopefully it's a question that we'll find out at some point. But until then, we'll see. Now, all of that was dealing with drinking water that is coming from a drinking water plant. But if you live in a more rural area, more than likely your drinking water is coming from a well water. As I mentioned before, well water is essentially you have a well that is pumping into the groundwater. This groundwater is pretty clean because Earth has its own filtration processes that will clean that water. You have tons of different soils, tons of different microorganisms, which will break down any kind of pollutants in that groundwater. So think of it as a natural source of drinking water. Now, just because it's a natural source does not necessarily mean it's safer water, because it really just depends on what else is going in to that groundwater. So for example, here I have you can't really see it, but the groundwater is essentially all of this in here. In this groundwater, here's a landfill that maybe the lining broke, and so now that landfill muck is now draining into the soil and into the groundwater. Here's a septic tank that is way too close to the groundwater and is linking in the groundwater. Here's a storm drain or an injection well that was not in regulation and going to the groundwater. Here's fertilizers and pesticides and road salt and everything that runs off of humans into the groundwater. Now this is kind of an extreme example. But the point being is that your groundwater is very, very dependent on what's around you. You are affected by your neighbors. Maybe your septic system and everything you do is perfect, but that groundwater can get contaminated by someone a couple miles away. And again, if you have less than 25 people on your well water, no one's regulating that. You have to be the one that does all of the testing. An example of some contaminated groundwater occurred in Hinckley, California. If you guys have ever heard or seen Aaron Brockovich was about this issue. There was a company there that had chromium-6. Chromium-6 is a heavy metal that really affects children. A lot of these pollutants are going to affect children the most because they are still developing. So this company was releasing chromium-6 because it was a byproduct of whatever they were doing into various pools, but these pools didn't have any kind of lighting. They just dug a hole and put it in that hole. Well, that liquid is going to seep through the soil, and it did, into the groundwater. And that groundwater was being used by the residents of Hinckley. What came out of it is we saw people that had a higher rate of cancer in the lung, in the mouth, and the nose, so through the entire respiratory system. Much higher incidence than in surrounding towns. This is just kind of showing, here is where that pool was, and you see how much groundwater was getting into that surrounding area. And again, people relying on this groundwater for, their livelihood. One last thing I want to talk about with groundwater and potential contamination is this hydraulic fracturing. This is also called fracking for short, and you'll really hear it referred to, especially in the news, as fracking. What fracking is, it's a new way of getting oil and natural gas. I say new, it's been around since the 1940s, but new in the sense that it is being used a lot more within the past decade. It's a really great way to get natural gas and oil. Briefly, the way it works is these companies take a drill and they drill a hole down and to the side. And what they do is they insert these chemicals at a very, very high pressure. And the point is to crack the surrounding soil. So by pumping this liquid in really, really fast and really, really hard, it's going to break this soil up. And it's going to create all these cracks. Well, when you create these cracks, that's going to loosen any natural gas or any oil that was found in that soil and found in those rocks. And that oil and natural gas will travel back up this well and will collect it and then sell it for energy, etc. Now this is an injection well. Remember earlier, some injection wells are septic tanks or people putting waste into a well in the ground. However, fracking is exempt. These kind of wells are exempt. They're putting chemicals in the ground, but they're actually not monitored at all. We actually have no idea what chemicals are in there. Now this sounds like a perfect injection well to be covered by the EPA, and I would agree with you, but it's exempt. Why? It's exempt because of this Halliburton loophole. Halliburton is the company, so I'm going to write company that more or less invented fracking. They hold the patent for fracking. They came up with this methodology. And they came up with this methodology in 1940. That doesn't necessarily mean they were using it in the 40s, but they knew how to use it in the 40s. The old CEO of Halliburton happens to be Dick Cheney. If you don't know who Dick Cheney is, Dick Cheney used to be the Vice President of the United States. And he's the one who put in this Halliburton exemption. He is the one who pushed through Congress saying, yes, injection wells should be monitored. Septic tanks should be monitored. We don't want to, disrupt groundwater. However, fracking, let's grant them an exception. They don't have to tell us what chemicals they're putting in. They don't have to tell us how often they're doing it. They don't have to monitor the groundwater. They can put it in the groundwater. That's fine. And that's this law to this day, is that places with fracking don't have to admit anything to anyone. Now this is causing problems because these chemicals are getting into the groundwater. Now this is happening again in small towns, in poor towns, in towns that unfortunately not a lot of people are paying attention to. There's a video that's going to come up or that you should watch after this, showing you what is happening to people who live here, what is happening to the water that they are exposed to by living here. So in summary, our drinking water is cleaned by two ways. Depending on where you live, it goes through a drinking water filtration plant, and tons of things are happening in order to clean it up. Or you get well water. Well water depends on Earth's natural processes in order to clean it. But no matter which way you get your water, there's dangers exposed at both sides. You can have contaminants in it. You could have contaminants directly in the water, contaminants in the distribution system. So the biggest thing is you have to be vigilant. You have to learn where your drinking water is coming from and how is it doing in those regulations.